Hello, so for today's After Café talk, we're going to be discussing methods for determining crystallite and single crystal orientation. To do this, I'm going to give a couple of definitions at the beginning, then I'm going to talk about some XRD techniques, Raman, and electron backscatter diffraction, EBSD. So just to start with XRD, typically we'll get patterns that look something like this for powder data, where you can see Lowy rings here that, this is not the greatest pattern that you've ever seen, but the rings are pretty uniform. It's a little bit noisy until you realize that this X-ray diffraction pattern was taken here by this. So this was taken on Mars by the Mars rover. So that's pretty cool. So how do you determine orientation? So there's a couple of definitions here that are useful. So when we talk about preferred orientation, this term usually is used for powder diffraction to indicate a non-random orientation of the crystallites in a specimen. So in the image that we just saw, you saw rings that were fairly uniform. That means that the powder that was measured there is pretty random. All possible orientations were visible there. Generally in X-ray diffraction, you want to avoid preferred orientation. You really do want randomness in order to be able to accurately sample all possible orientations of the crystal if you're trying to do phase ID, for instance. But sometimes you do get preferred orientation in your samples. Texture is also a term to indicate non-random orientation, and this is usually in the context of a film or a bulk specimen. So it's often used to talk about the degree of orientation or the distribution of grain orientations that exist in a sample. So on the right at the bottom, this is a cast piece of metal here, and you can see the grains in there. And this indicates that there are certain grains that have preferred orientation or texture in the sample because some orientations are more, you can see the patterns in the sample quite clearly. So many material properties depend on texture. You have strength, corrosion resistance, resistance to cracking, or when stress crackings occur, even magnetic properties are dependent on texture. So in things like transformers, how the metal is cast matters. And so if the sample was cast or it was a rolled alloy, this will really influence the texture. So an old technique to do this was you could take your part and etch it, and this would then reveal the grain structure because the etchant would usually start eating away at grain boundaries. So in this piece of metal here is an example from Wikipedia. You can clearly see that at the top here, the grain structure is very kind of, you see these lines running very clearly around the semicircle at the top, whereas in the middle, closer to the handle here, it's a lot more uniform. And this type of thing really matters. So if you're doing things like turbine blades, the texture will influence, whether or when a turbine, for instance, might break. So this has some real world consequences. This was flight 328 back in 2001. One of the fan blades separated and went through the cowling, causing a uncontrolled, explosion in the engine, which fortunately nobody was hurt, but this caused a whole lot of going back and, safety checks on all sorts of turbines on these types of engines. So how do we see texture? So in a polycrystalline sample in XRD, because each, if you have a random orientation here, you would expect to see all possible grains. And the intensity for each allowed reflection, gives you the height of the peak that you see there. So in this example here, the first peak, it comes from 100 planes. Then you see 110 planes, 111 planes, 200 planes, 210 planes. All of the possible planes that could be visible are seen because there will be some crystallite in the diffraction condition. Now, the extreme opposite end of this is a single crystal. There's only one set of planes. There's only one orientation that will be visible in the sample. So in this case, only the 100 set of planes exists. The 110 set of planes will be off at an angle that is not in the Bragg condition, so we shouldn't see it at all. And so those peaks drop out of the sample entirely, and we only see the 100, 200, 300, etc. Family of planes. And if you're somewhere in between, then one way that you can see this is through the structure factors, which give you the intensities of the various peaks. So you can do a theoretical calculation which tells you what the relative intensities of the various peaks are going to be. And if you have a powder diffraction file card like this table, it will tell you what the relative intensities of all of these peaks should be to each other, theoretically, by calculations using the structure factor. If you have an oriented sample, then these relative intensities are not going to scale correctly. Some planes are going to be more numerous than other planes, and therefore the intensities are not going to scale the way that you would expect for a random powder. So if it's random, the peak intensity ratios match. If it is not random, they will not match. So here's an example. This is a PCT film on platinum silicon oxide silicon substrate. These are for two different films with different levels of orientation. So this first one here is pretty random. You see a whole bunch of different peaks here from the different orientations. And the second one is oriented. And as you can see here, the 001 peak is much, much more intense, and other peaks like the 101 are completely missing from the pattern. So in order to analyze this, you can do things like Rietveld refinements, where then you look at the relative intensities of these and work it back to a degree of orientation. Another way that you can look at orientation is to directly measure the distribution of where certain planes are in space. And so one way you can do this is by using pole figures. So here we have an example of a view of the inside of one of the XRD instruments. This is the high-res instrument that we have in the materials characterization lab. It's a Malvern Panalytical MRD system. And what you can do is you can use the goniometer to go to various different angles in the sample. So this is moving the 2 theta position. This is the detector moving in 2 theta. Then you can move the sample. This is the omega axis. Then we have other orientations. This is phi, so this is rotating the sample. And then there's also this chi axis here, which is tilting the sample from vertical down to horizontal. So you can measure in all of these different orientations and see where the reflections are in your sample. So here we have some examples of antimony or bismuth antimony thin films that were grown on sapphire wafers. So going from the center of these scans outward is the chi angle, and the phi angle is the rotation around the circle. And as you can see here, for sapphire, we get 3 peaks. This is C-axis oriented sapphire. Sapphire has a rhombohedral crystal symmetry, which is threefold. So we see 3 peaks here in this pole figure. If we look at antimony, which was grown on top of this, we're looking at the 012 reflection, and it also has a rhombohedral structure. And the 3 peaks that we see are consistent with that, and they are lined up with the sapphire. So this tells us that the antimony is epitaxial to the sapphire. It has the same orientation as the substrate. On the second sample here, the sapphire is rotated slightly, but again, we only see 3 peaks. But bismuth antimony here, now we're seeing 6 peaks. And what this tells us is that the sample is twinned. We have 180-degree rotated domains in the sample. So part of the sample has, you could imagine it if you're thinking of a triangle, it's pointing to the right, and another domains in the sample, they're pointing to the left. And we have both of these. We average over both of them when we measure, and instead of a 3-fold pattern, now you see a 6-fold pattern. So this is an example of seeing the texture in a thin film sample. And you can do similar things for metal parts, for instance. A typical way of looking at these is doing pole figures and then working out what's called the orientation distribution function. You use the pole figure to map the angular distribution of a set of planes. You would probably measure multiple sets of planes and get patterns, data that looks like this. So again, this is some data posted on Wikipedia. And then you would use some software to try to work back from these pole figures to what's the most likely distribution of orientations in your sample that would give those pole figures. So the orientation distribution function is basically the volume fraction of grains with certain orientations in the sample, which then you would work back to, the properties and performance of your material. So another technique you can use is Raman crystallography. In this case, you would be using polarized light, both on the incident light coming in and light that comes back out of the sample. So we would choose whether the beam coming in, is polarized, in one direction or another, and then we use a polarizer on the reflected light to be able to see how the Raman reflections change the polarization. So as an example of this, we typically use a notation that looks like this: Z parentheses XY Z bar. So the light comes in Z, it's reflected back out in negative Z, Z bar, and it has a polarization. So the excitation polarization in this case is X, and the scattered polarization direction is Y. And this is how this changes depends entirely on the polarizability tensor that governs the Raman scattering. So the intensity depends on this polarizability tensor, and what you can see is this is an example of CVD diamond 100 oriented. The incident polarization direction comes in one direction, and depending on whether you do parallel or perpendicular polarization, you see a difference in the number of peaks and the angles that you get with respect to the sample. You can go through this then and do these measurements as a function of angle, and because you know the symmetry of the crystal gives you the polarizability tensor. You can then work back to what the crystal faces of this sample must have been. So here we can see that, for instance, the top left here is the 0, 1, 1 face of the diamond. So you can determine crystal orientation through Raman by these polarizability tensors. The more complicated the symmetry of your sample is, the more complicated the polarizability tensor is. Finally, the last technique I want to talk about is electron backscatter diffraction. So this is a scanning electron microscopy technique in which backscattered electrons are diffracted by the lattice of the sample. And this gives rise to what are called Kikuchi lines. These generally show up from a depth of about tens of nanometers into the sample. And in order to be able to see these Kikuchi lines, you have to have a highly polished sample. So you have to do some very careful sample prep in order to be able to measure these. But once you have a highly polished sample, you can use the SEM beam to look at different areas of the sample and see how the orientation changes spatially. So as an example here, this little animated GIF, you can see that as the crystal rotates the Kikuchi lines, the diffraction pattern that you see changes. And then you use some software to figure out, given the Kikuchi line pattern that you're seeing, what orientation that must correspond to. So this is an image pulled off of the MCL website where you can see the orientations of the various crystallites in space because of the reconstruction of the Kikuchi lines in different places. The software then colorizes each of these different orientations with a different color, and so you can see the range of orientations very easily by eye. Just to give a slightly more concrete idea of what's going on here, if you look on the left, this is grains in stainless steel. So in the first dot there, you get one Kikuchi pattern. The second dot, you get a different one. These correspond to two different orientations, and then this is what gets colorized in the image in the middle. Also, if you have a focused ion beam, it is possible to etch away sections of the surface and do this as a depth profile, and then you can actually get the full 3D structure of the grains inside of a sample, which is pretty neat. So just to conclude, a couple of really useful links. There's this first link for stenographic projections. This is really helpful if you want to learn how to interpret pole figures. There's also a great tutorial on texture at the same website. There's an EBSD tutorial at this website, and Oxford Instruments also has a great introduction to EBSD. So if you have any questions, feel free to talk to us, and I thank you.